Okay, so my name is Amy Bradfield. I'm the Education Program Manager here at the Historical Society of Michigan. I'm actually in my kitchen in Lansing. I'm not at the Historical Society of Michigan, but that's who I work for. I'm also the state coordinator for Michigan History Day. So I am responsible for making sure all the contests happen, getting information to people, and running the state finals. And if you haven't heard, our state finals are going to be virtual this year, just like they were last year. So more information will be coming about that. But thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to be speaking today on the annual theme and some possible topic ideas. It's really important that selecting your topic is probably the most important thing you do in the Michigan History Day project. And so you want to make sure that you're selecting a topic that connects to the theme, and this year's theme is Communication and History, the Key to Understanding, and is a topic that you are interested in and you like, because you're going to be spending a lot of time with this topic. So if you pick something that isn't of great interest to you, but you think it might be easy, it might be a little bit more challenging. So please, when you're thinking about topics, or even if you've selected a topic, you might want to be open to some different ideas to really make it the best fit for you and for this year's theme. But before we talk about topics, we're going to discuss the theme a little bit and delve into that. So the first part of the theme is communication and history. And here's a real broad, basic definition of communication: how words, thoughts, or ideas are exchanged throughout history. And so there's all kinds of possibilities of what you can do for this year's theme. I'm interested to know, and you can put this in the chat if you want, how are some ways that you think people communicate? What are some examples of ways that people communicate or with one another? Could be individuals, could be groups of people. You can put it in the chat if you like. I see someone said art. I'm going to bring up a couple ideas, but feel free if you want to keep sharing ideas in there, please do so through the chat. This is part of a document that I pulled from MHD Utah. I'm a big believer in sharing from what other people create. We have created a resources folder. So all of the documents that I indicate and talk about today, I've put in that folder. And after the session, after we're done today, we'll make sure to share a link to that folder for you so you can have access to all the documents that I and other presenters share for our sessions today. So this is just part of that document, but I like some of the ideas that they had on there. They said some other types of communication is discussion. Things like newspapers, letters, conventions, political conventions, other type of conventions. Artistic expression, like Emily said, art. So there's poetry, music, painting, sculpture, anything that has to do with kind of an entertainment value could definitely be part of communication. Language itself with codes and code breaking. Assimilation, that would be forcing someone to learn a certain language to fit in with the culture. And we'll talk about a topic idea later for that, but an example they give through the MHD theme book is for Hawaii, and when people were forced to give up their language and learn English to assimilate and become American. And innovation, whether it's how people communicate or something like that, it's also part of helping those people communicate. Some additional ideas, communication to educate and inform. So newspapers again and magazines, radio and television, diaries, books, photography. That would be a really interesting topic to look at today, the use of visuals to communicate. Propaganda, things like wartime posters, political cartoons, movies, newsreels, especially when you think about those from World War II. And how before everyone went to a movie theater, they put up the newsreel, and it would help hopefully build people's patriotic sensibilities and maybe make them buy war bonds, and how that was communicating. And then dissent, another type of communication, comes from people not happy with the current situation and what's going on, and using things like pamphlets, speeches, and protests. Now, other is on there because this is not an exhaustive list. This is not everything that you can pull from. Let's see, I think we got some more stuff in the chat. I see newspapers and blogs, music, media, television. So a lot of the ones that we had on here, telephone, radio, news, media, those are all good examples of and types of communication. But that's not it. There are more. And even on the document I'm sharing with you, there are more examples. So if you're still thinking about a topic, this is a way to kind of look at it differently and try something else. So one part is how people communicate, and that's what we just kind of quickly went over, but you also need to consider why people communicate and why they are trying to speak, or why they're using art, or why they're writing those newspaper articles, or why they're dissatisfied and holding a protest. So some examples of why people communicate and what can help you start thinking about a topic and connecting it to the theme is to share ideas and information. That's a pretty basic way of why people communicate. Also to help people, right? To teach them to use those ideas and information to make their life better. And probably the most basic one is to get what they want. That's a real basic thing of communication. And I think about a little baby with this example. If you've ever been around a newborn, they're usually pretty content until they start to get hungry. And then they start to fuss a little bit. And if they don't get that food as quick as they thought they should get it, they quickly go from 0 to 100, where they are yelling and screaming, and it gets on your nerves. And that's how they communicate. They don't have words. They can't do anything else. And if they don't communicate, they won't survive. And so looking at why people are communicating and the reasons behind it is part of that understanding communication history, but also leads us to that second part of the theme, which is key to understanding. And this is definitely a year, sometimes when we have things that have multiple pieces to it, like exploration, encounter, and exchange, or triumph and tragedy, we say you don't have to, sometimes MHD says you don't have to do every single piece of that theme. You can focus on one of them. This is not the year for that. You have to address both what the communication is in history, the type of communication you're talking about, and then the key to understanding what it helped people do or what it didn't help people do. So the key to understanding, I'm pulling a lot of this information from the MHD theme book, which we'll talk about in a second. But American journalist Sidney J. Harris wrote, "The two words information and communication are often used interchangeably, but they signify quite different things. Information is giving out, communication is getting through." So information is extremely important, but if we fail to get our point across or miscommunicate the information, it often leads to unintended results. So you have to be able to explain, express how, what your communication was trying to get through, what your communication that you're talking about was trying to achieve. And that'll help get to that key to understanding. So another way to kind of think of this is miscommunication, right? We talk about people kind of thinking outside the box and trying something different and thinking of this theme in a different way. And this may help you with that. So you can think about how has miscommunication or failure to communicate shaped history. It could be conflicts between cultural groups. An example for me that comes to mind is going pretty far back with Europeans coming over to the New World and discovering things, but Native Americans having lived here for a long time and not understanding either with language or the culture and the conflicts that came up from that. And then later on, even when the United States forms, what happens as the United States expands and moves out, and their interactions with those different Native American communities and those different cultural groups and what happens between them, and the miscommunication that leads to a lot of strife and a lot of challenges. Also, conflicts between countries. If you're a fan of military history, this is a pretty good theme for you this year, because that is full of miscommunication when countries go to war and they fight. Or even more specifically, outcomes in battle. If a general makes a plan and wants this, group to watch the right flank, and that group doesn't make it there, either they didn't get the message or they didn't understand what they were supposed to do, that whole battle has now changed. And so looking at how that miscommunication impacted what happened is part of looking and delving into the theme. So when you start to pick a topic, make sure you can answer the following questions that are on the page are on the screen. So those questions are, what are the short-term changes and what are the long-term changes? So if you were to do something like the telegraph, what happened immediately after the telegraph started? What has the telegraph led to today? Or, you know, happened 100 years after it, or even up to today. If you have trouble answering these questions after you do some basic research, you may want to find a different topic. You may want to look at your topic in a different way, because identifying the results of the communication will help understand what people understood or didn't understand. And so that's a really important part of it. So if you can't answer this question after you start looking into your topic, you may need to reframe your topic or think of choosing something else, and you still have plenty of time to do that. So when we're looking at the theme, there's some big important pieces to remember, right? So the first part is that communication history. You need to identify the forms of communication or miscommunication. The next part of the theme is, what did that communication help people understand? And that's part of the short term and the long term. And what's good about looking at that is knowing the short term and long term effects also help with another part of the project of what you need to do. Another big part of your responsibility when creating a Michigan History Day project is the significance, and talking about why your topic is important and how it impacts our world today. So those are three big pieces when you are looking at a topic and you're trying to figure out the theme, that you want to make sure that you're keeping in your mind and you're running all your sources through and you're connecting your sources to. Some resources to help you with the theme. There's, MHD has got some fantastic resources. They have a wonderful introduction video that isn't too long, that kind of goes over some highlights of the theme. They have their theme book that they create every year that has really good examples, certain topics, some lesson plans, some ways of thinking about things. They also every year make a graphic organizer that can help you start to kind of take your topic and make sure that you're able to connect to that theme. We also have lots of resources on the Michigan history, the Historical Society of Michigan page, our MHD page. So I've linked right on there to the theme book, the theme narrative. That's just usually a 3-page document, kind of beginning of the theme book that just talks about the theme. I have the graphic organizer on there, and I link right to the theme page. Minnesota in History is a phenomenal History Day in Minnesota is a great program. They make lots of good resources. They have 2 videos that are about 6 minutes long with theme overview and theme reminders. They even have one that's a theme topics. So if you go to, these are YouTube videos, you can, or Vimeo, I think, you can watch those, and just more resources to help you get some more information and stuff about the theme. Okay, so I'm gonna see if there are any questions. And if so, we're a pretty small group, so if you want to unmute your mic, you can, but does anyone have any questions at this point about the theme? Because we're getting ready to talk about some topics. Okay, that's all right. Hold on to it, and we'll have more time at the end. Okay, so looking at topics, moving in, and that's still, we're going to still pull in stuff with the theme with that. These go hand in hand. Is, like I said earlier, you have to find a topic that interests you. Now, some teachers recommend or say that you have to find your topic from a certain, like maybe it's a subject area that you are learning about that year. And that's fine, because there's still a lot of stuff that you can do. Even if it's, you have to find something in, say, world history or a different period of US history than you're interested in, you can probably find a way to connect your interests and what you like with that. So some ideas of areas that you can pull from is your own history, right? Like your family history or local history of the area around you. That's a great way to make a connection to your community, is to delve into what happened in the area that you lived at. Excuse me. Another one is entertainment, music, art, movies, and television. Everyone loves that entertainment, and so that will be a good way of kind of thinking of a topic. Not that it's so much entertainment, but I've been thinking about an idea and I haven't really fleshed it out yet. But I thought street art, like whether it's graffiti or something like that, could be an interesting topic this year of what people are trying to communicate when they use street art. But you'd have to go kind of to the beginnings of it. Science, technology, innovations that have been made, medical innovations of, figuring out how we communicate and how that's changed. I think sports is going to be a challenge this year. We've been trying to think of some ideas of good sports topics, and I've heard when I've met with students some ideas, but remember, it has to be communication and then the impact or what people understand from that communication. So I believe it's possible. It just may not be as easy as it's been in previous years to talk about sports. And then military history. If that is an interest of you, this is a pretty good topic for it, like I said before. Wars and conflicts are a great example of communication or miscommunication and what happened as a result of that. Again, you can choose from anything. We are Michigan History Day, but it doesn't have to be Michigan history. We love it when you do Michigan history because we love Michigan history. But it can be from world history, local, national, state, any era that interests you. We do recommend that you pick a topic that is 25 years or older. And there's a variety of reasons for that. One of the parts that you have to consider when you do a project is the significance in history. If you pick something that happened recently, it's hard to know what that true significance is. Also, sometimes the sources, there may be some great primary sources if you pick something recently, but there hasn't been a really good amount of secondary sources where historians have analyzed it, and you're able to pull upon that to kind of help connect you to that theme. So it's not a rule that you have to pick something 25 years or older, but we just recommend it because in the long run, it'll probably make it a little bit easier for you. That being said, if you're really interested in, say, an artist that is very popular today and has just recently started doing their work, you may be able to look at who influenced that artist, and that may have come from a while ago and would give you more information to research. And you should be connecting your topic to today. So then you can pull in that interest that's more recent today, but do the bulk of your work on an influence of that or an early part that got that moving and got that going. We recommend you do some preliminary research, right? So think of a couple of different topics and kind of start working with those topics. If you've already chosen your topic, that's fine. Some people know right away what they want to do, but you may want to make sure you can answer these questions or maybe see if there's a different way that you can frame your topic, and it might lead to something else. This is from a document that was created by National History Day in Idaho. It's in the resources folder, and that has you pick 3 topics. And you take each of those topics and you talk about what happened. Just, explain the event as much detail as you can. When it happened, who were the groups of people involved? Why did it happen? What were the causes of it? And how do you think this topic fits the theme? And so I know sometimes you get an idea in your head and you just go with it, and you might miss some other really exciting or different ideas out there. So if you haven't really settled on a topic yet, pick some from different areas, do a little bit of research and see what you're finding before you kind of decide on what you want to do. Because again, the more that you find a topic that's right for you and for the theme, the easier it will be to do your research and the easier it will be to create your project. So I want to take a little time to talk about some topic ideas and suggestions. These are Michigan ideas because I work for the Historical Society of Michigan and I love Michigan history. And again, you don't have to do that, but I bet a lot of these topics, if something is like, oh, that could be interesting, it may work for a different area or a different piece of history that you are more interested in. The first one we've been discussing is the Green Book. Many of you may be familiar with that. A movie was made about it a couple years ago, but for those of you who aren't, I'm going to give a quick little rundown of it. The Green Book was written by an African-American postal worker. It started in the 1930s, the mid to late 1930s. And the idea behind the book was it listed any gas stations, hotels, restaurants, people's houses, kind of like we would have like an Airbnb today, that were friendly to African American travelers. Because when this book came out in the 30s and 40s and 50s, segregation was rampant, and it wasn't safe for African Americans to travel. Or if they did travel, they didn't have anywhere they could stop to even use the restroom. And so this postal worker decided, a mailman decided to put together a book and publish that book that would go all over the country and let people know, you know, where it was safe to travel. Good connection to Michigan, not in the very first issue, but I believe in 1938 is when Michigan first appears in the book, especially cities like Detroit, Jackson, Idlewild, other areas, but it's surprising to see some of the other places in Michigan. So you could look at the Green Book in Michigan and what that book was communicating and what it helps us understand about that period of time and what was happening in the United States. An interesting thing, I didn't know much about the Green Book when I first started looking at it, was there was actually something similar that the gentleman who got the idea from, was that Jewish people had a similar book because they also faced discrimination when they traveled. So that could be a different way of looking at it too as well. Indian boarding schools would be a fantastic topic for this year, because the students that were oftentimes forced to go to the boarding schools were not allowed to speak their native language. They were forced to speak English to become American and to be good Americans. And so you could look at how that that changed their forms of communication, you know, not being able to communicate with their parents, their community members, how that language is now lost in some senses from what, you know, what we generally know about that group. That would be a really interesting way to look at this year's theme, that communication in history, and they're getting it taken away from that idea of assimilation, what that did to their culture, and even more importantly, looking at the significance, how a lot of those groups are trying to bring back that language today and to kind of make amends for what happened, and correct the wrongs of the government and the runner of those boarding schools saying you can't speak your language. The last boarding school closed in Michigan and in the Mount Pleasant area in 1983. So this is not something that happened just in the late 1800s, early 1900s, or even the early 1800s. It went all the way up to 1983. And so there's some good information that you can find about that. Lighthouses. That is a really interesting form of communication. It's nonverbal. And so you could look at, Michigan's got some lighthouses. You could look at, every single lighthouse has its own light signal. So people who are traveling know where they're at based on the signal they're seeing. The same thing with foghorns. They have a distinctive sound for each one, how the blasts are done. So that would be a really interesting to look at for this year's theme. Prison postcards, this actually came from Sarah Gross at the Michigan History Center. And Sarah, if I butcher this, feel free to chime in and help me with this one. But in the late 1800s, the prisons that were built were often beautiful architectural buildings. And for some people, it was the idea of, you know, if you build a beautiful building, maybe it will help rehabilitate or make these people's lives better. But these buildings were so interesting and architecturally beautiful that they made postcards of them, and people could go and buy postcards and would send them around. And so I don't know if you can imagine us doing that today, but that'd be a really interesting way of looking at that communication and what that was helping people understand, like what that tells us about society at that time, what that tells us about, you know, their think on prisons and all of that stuff. So you could look into that. Another one is Santa-like petroglyphs. This is more of an older history, so going back further. Those are, you know, in that thumb area of Michigan, where they're glyphs that were carved into stone. And so that would be a good thing to look at, was what was that communication, what were they trying to communicate, and what did it help us understand, and then the importance of protecting those today, and making sure that we don't lose those, and the work that both tribal governments and the Michigan government has done, Michigan Department of Transportation and others, to really study those and record them and make sure that we have a good record of them, because they may eventually disappear because they're outside and they're in rocks. Motown is another good topic for this year. With music, if you like music, you know, and we should have time for me to go into an example of using Motown, but the idea of the communication, that it's music is the communication, but what does it help us understand about society at that time? What changes did it make to society? And that is a Detroit business, so it's a good connection to Michigan. And then the Underground Railroad would be another excellent topic. Great connections to Michigan, especially after the Fugitive Slave Acts were passed in the 1850s. Many escaped enslaved people were freedom seekers, came through Michigan and did, you know, that I-94 corridor. They kind of traveled along that. It wasn't 94 back then, but that way through, coming up through southwestern Michigan in places like Vandalia and Three Rivers, heading up to Kalamazoo, Battle Creek, Jackson, Ypsilanti, and making over to Detroit, where it was a really quick, easy trip over to Canada, where slave catchers couldn't go, and bring them back. And so how did people communicate with that Underground Railroad, especially the fact that most enslaved people were not educated? And you wanted to, you know, the understanding of keeping it secret and keeping it where people didn't find out, slave catchers didn't find out what was going on, where they would catch them. So that would be an excellent topic this year. I do want to look on that website, that theme information page that that we have. We do have some ideas on here, and a lot of those are the ones I've discussed, but they also have examples for resources. So the prison postcards here, the resources, you can find it. Rail Riders is one that was on there. Native American, we have the petroglyphs, treaties, and then we also have some information about you know, loss of indigenous language because of US government policies. So there's some good information on there, some good ideas that you can take a look at if you like to do a Michigan topic. Oops, hold on, gotta go through this again. All right, so if you want to do a national or world history topic, you can of course do that. You know, there's no problems with that. But one thing you can think about doing is trying to connect it to Michigan, and a great way to do that is through newspapers. And I'm hoping that Tim Gleisner later, when he talks about digital research, and maybe even Sarah when she talks about good sources, I'm sure they'll be talking about some newspapers. But by connecting it to Michigan, you're making it more kind of your own original thought, and you know, it connects to your community and makes it a little more meaningful for you. So of course you can do a national world history topic, but maybe you can do a connection to Michigan. And an easy way to do that, like with newspapers, is let's say you did Pearl Harbor. Instead of looking at newspaper titles from New York City or Chicago, you could see what were they saying in Detroit, or what were the headings in Detroit, or what were the headings in the newspapers in your town, because probably there's a record of that somewhere. Those newspapers are digital, whether it's through the Library of Congress, you know, Chronicling America, or other things. But, you know, we recommend you try and connect to Michigan, just to make it a little bit more meaningful for you. I do also want to talk about some caution topics this year. Every year there are topics that we kind of predict are going to be popular because of the theme, and a lot of these have come from National History Day. They think so as well, and they've done this theme before, so they kind of know. Navajo code talkers and codes in general. Now, this is not to say you can't do this, it's just that it may be a very popular topic. So how will your project stand out from other people's? How will you have research that is more unique and exciting than just the basic research that's out there? Enigma code, like the Enigma code and the breaking machines from World War II, have also been very popular. So again, we're not saying you can't do it, we're just saying be cautious, because when topics are really popular, it's hard for things to stand out. For example, I think in Triumph and Tragedy, which was 2 years ago, the Titanic was a huge topic, which I never would have predicted, but it was. Some other ones are things like the telegraph, Alexander Graham Bell, and Helen Keller. They all have strong connections to the theme. They all have to do with communication and what it helps us understand, the key to understanding. But, you know, you might want to be careful if you decide to do that topic. Okay, so I want to go through kind of an example, and we have plenty of time for that, but I wanted to stop and see if anyone has any questions at this point. Don't be shy. And I'm hoping we'll have time at the end that maybe if you're willing to, you can share your topic ideas or things that you're thinking about. Any questions? You should be able to unmute, or you can put them in the chat. Okay, so I'm going to keep on going, but if you think of, write them down, put them in the chat, and then we'll have time at the end. So I thought it might help to kind of go through a topic and start looking at how you can think about it, and do that connection to the theme, right? And how that'll help you kind of understand that theme by looking at a topic. So I'm going to take Motown, and this is the idea that communication happens in gatherings. So what do you think is happening in this picture? And you can unmute and share, you can put in the chat. Take a look at this image. What do you think is happening in this image?
Okay, I'll unmute.
Yeah.
Good. My son says they're dancing and singing.
Okay, dancing and singing. Yep, you got it. You can see this gentleman over here on the right. He's got his mouth open and a microphone, so we're assuming he's singing, and these guys are probably singing as well if they're dancing. Yep, so this is a picture of the Temptations at the Apollo Theater. And the Apollo Theater was in New York, but the Temptations were a Motown group. So if you're not familiar with Motown, it was started by Berry Gordy in Detroit. It's a very famous record label that helped change society and bring together a racially divided country. It's the first African-American owned record label to be a national success. And they created music that reached all people regardless of the color of their skin. And Berry Gordy was really actually pretty smart about this. He knew from what was going on in the United States at that time in the 50s, the 40s and the 50s, that people were very, had different ideas about different cultures and different groups of people. And so oftentimes on the cover of the albums they would make, he would not put the artists on there because he felt that, and he knew that some people wouldn't buy the album just because it had a person of color on it. And so he would just put cartoons or images or things that represented the music, but wasn't the artists themselves. And they found that it was more successful in getting people to buy the music. They use music to bring attention to social issues, things like War, performed by Edwin Starr, and What's Going On by Marvin Gaye, which were in like the 70s with, in the late 60s with the Vietnam War, really made people question what was happening and what was going on, as Marvin Gaye said, and made them look at that and start to question what was going on in society around them. And I'm sure many of you can think about lyrics of musicians today, that are talking about social injustice, are, talking about gender roles, are talking about a variety of things. And that's not new to this period of time. Artists have been doing that for a long time, but there's definitely messages that are communicated through those lyrics in the music. Okay, so let's take a look at this picture. And what do you notice about it? What do you see when you look at this picture? Again, you can unmute or you can put it in the chat. Oh, and while you're thinking about that, we had someone in the chat, wonderful Bob Myers, say that the outfits they were wearing was interesting because the suits that they wore and how they were dressed as a form of communication, and contrasting that with what artists look like today. And that was, we'll talk about that a little bit that was very purposeful in Motown of what they did and what they wore. So I've seen people saying it's a hall. Someone said it's a segregated auditorium, which means that there's, all the people of color are sitting on the left side of our picture here, and people who are white or Euro-American are sitting here. The balcony is a little bit trickier. It's hard kind of to see in here what's going on up there. But if it's not segregated, I would assume it was, or it was divided by color, but it does look like it's mostly Euro-Americans or white people or Caucasians that are up there. Where do you think this photo was taken? I see some people saying, are there women upstairs? Yes, I see women upstairs and that they're all male. I think there are definitely some women upstairs, but I don't know if we see any women sitting downstairs. That's good. No one has noticed this. All this time I've done this, no one's talked about the gender of that. Where do you think this picture was taken? I can give you 2 hints. It's the United States of America, and it's not Michigan. So what state do you think this picture was taken in? And someone else said, yep, they're wearing uniforms. So people are wearing uniforms in here. Any guesses? Georgia, I see someone said Georgia, Washington, D.C., Alabama. So it looks like the people have put it in are thinking it's mostly southern states. This photo was taken at the Naval Training Station, which would explain the uniforms, in the Great Lakes Naval Training Station in Illinois. It was an audience for a concert presented by vocalist Paul Robeson on July 16th, 1943. So Paul Robeson was an African-American performer. He was an actor, singer, and he was also an activist. And so the concert, the man they're coming to see is African-American. But at this time in the United States, audiences were often segregated when they went into movie theaters or places like this, like concert halls and things like that. And a lot of times people think it happened just in the South, but it didn't. It happened all over the United States. And so, you know, these audiences were forced to sit based on the color of their skin. And again, it wasn't just in the South, it was all over. This is in Illinois. What's interesting is that Mr. Robeson, when he finished with his performance, he may not have been able to go and eat at restaurants with everyone else that wanted to go eat. He may have had difficulty staying in hotels, even in Illinois. And so he was the person that came in to entertain these people, and he was still treated as a second-class citizen and not allowed to go where everyone was allowed to go, even in Illinois, and it happened in Michigan as well. Okay. Here's another source to look at, a poster, and we're going to look at the wording on this poster. Right at the top, it says White Rock and Roll Show and Dance in Bluefield Auditorium, and down here it says Reserved Section for Colored Spectators. So we know right from this poster that this is going to be a segregated audience. The popularity of music from Motown and other African-American artists began to break down some of those racial barriers between people. And here's a quote by Lloyd Price, the gentleman who gave this concert. After the first intermission, the kids were all dancing together. I just kept playing my music and the kids kept coming. They were rebelling through dance, through a beat I created. They start realizing we're all human. And so this music and this popularity, and people would start dancing, getting up and enjoying the music, and pretty soon they'd start, those lines between would kind of blur. And maybe when they left that concert hall, they'd have a different understanding. They would have been taught their whole life that people of color were like this, but after that experience, it maybe changed what they were thinking and how they were thinking about, you know, people of color and how those people were treated. So when we're talking about the communication in this case, if I was doing a project, the communication, I would pick the like lyrics, right? The use of lyrics. That's the type of communication, what they're talking about. As Bob mentioned, how they dressed was also a way. Berry Gordy, again, was very cognizant of what society was like, and he knew to make his artists more successful, he had to make them marketable to a larger audience of people. So they had to go through classes of how to act, how to talk. They wore very specific clothing. And so that could be another way that you could look at Motown, and how that form of communication, their appearance, helped to start to change the way people thought about different cultural groups in society, or different groups of people in society. But to get to that key to understanding, right? So the communication is, let's say, the lyrics. We have to talk about those short-term changes that resulted from this type of communication. And in this case, it's people are connected by their love of music and started to understand one another a little bit better, and maybe a better understanding of a different group, a different culture. The long-term changes are that the artist touring and the messages in their music helped to really bring an end to that segregation. They played a part in the Civil Rights Act and laws being written to make sure people were treated equally and not discriminated against. Another long-term, effect of their communication, what they did, was musicians today. If you talk to any musician today, many of them have been influenced by a Motown artist, whether it's Michael Jackson, the Jackson 5, Diana Ross, the Supremes, or Stevie Wonder. There's a ton, the Temptations, there are a ton of artists, Marvin Gaye, that influenced those artists today. And so that's also part of that understanding of their lyrics, that they stand up. And recognizing that there's still work to do. As we know, it's not all fixed in the United States. It's slowly getting better, but there's still work to do. And that's okay to talk about in your project. You don't have to find something that has a happy, wonderful solution. That doesn't always happen. History is not always pretty. And so the understanding that there's still work that needs to be done. And that's good for you to recognize and look at in your projects. So again, we want you to make sure that when you're talking about the theme and connecting to the theme with your topic, there are 3 big pieces that you need to make sure that you're covering and making those connections. First, you want to identify the forms of communication or miscommunication, right? So how are they communicating? Then you want to think about the results of that communication. That leads to that key to understanding the short term and the long term. What happened right immediately after this communication was done? What were the long-term impacts? If it's like a battle, the short term is either they won or lost. The long term could be whether the outcome of the war, or even did it change the way that people fought, or the tactics of battles themselves. Connected to that, but always an important part that you need to be consistently going to, is why is your topic important? That's historical significance. We call it the so what. So how does your topic impact our world today? And I can give you an example from this year. I presented to a class, and the teacher let me, we were talking about some topics that the kids were coming up with after I presented. And a young lady was really excited about wanting to do like an oral history interview. And, she's like, oh, my grandparents went to a Bob Seger concert at Central Michigan University. Okay, I mean, that's communication. He was singing, right? But why is it important? Did something happen at that concert? Did he have a new song or say something different that he'd never performed or done anywhere else? Because if not, then it's not really significant. It didn't really impact the world today. So you need to make sure when you're finding a topic that you can answer that and you understand why it was important and why it mattered. And the final recommendation I want to give you when you're dealing with topics is the idea of narrowing your topic. I think a big challenge students have, especially when they hit those limits, right? Like you have 10 minutes for a documentary, 500 student composed words for an exhibit, 1,200 student composed words for a website, 2,500 words for a paper, and 10 minutes for a performance, is there's too much information. And so you need to really work on narrowing your topic and getting specific with it. So this is a document, this is shared in that resource folder. It's fillable, so you can type into it. And we've seen this in a variety of ways. I mean, almost every coordinator has one of these where it's like a funnel to narrow it. So let's look at Motown and what I did, right? So the theme this year is communication and history, the key to understanding. My interest is I like music history, I like music, and I like Michigan history. So I thought, ooh, Motown would be a good fit for me. But I can't do all of Motown, right? I have to really focus on how Motown, okay, it's music, it's communication, but I have to focus on that. What did it help people understand? What did it make society understand? And why is it significant? Why is it important? And there could be multiple examples of that. It's significant because it was, the first African-American, real successful record thing. But that might not be what I focus on, because what does that really help with the theme, right? So you'll find multiple things, but you got to pick the ones that are going to keep tying back to the theme and your argument that you're going to make, which we'll hear from later today from Toby Voigt, of making those historical arguments and thesis statements. So I got to narrow it down. So I'm going to narrow it to the power of Motown lyrics to change society, because that's talking about the communication of lyrics and what it's doing. It's helping us understand how it changed society. And then I've got to create a research question. So my first research question I come up to might be, how did Motown lyrics help to end segregation? That's a pretty broad question. I could spend a whole lot of time doing that, and it might help me, but it may not get me to what I specifically need. So if I can make really specific research questions, that's going to help me when I'm doing my research and when I'm putting my project together. So a more specific one might be, what ideas were communicated through Motown lyrics that question the practice of segregation, right? So how are they doing when they, what were they writing about, singing about, that made people kind of practice to question what was happening with segregation and the way people of color were being treated at this time in the United States? That is a question that I can find specific sources to that will then help me when I'm building my project later. And then the last step is, once you've gotten that research going, you start working, you're going to build that thesis statement, right? And my thesis statement will probably pull from parts of this. And I didn't write a thesis statement. You're going to see that later with Toby. But this, you really want to narrow it down, because narrowing it down will help you stay within those limits and will help you be very focused on what you're talking about. Okay, so that is it for me. I wanted to see if anyone has any questions, or if anyone is thinking of some topics that they would want to share, like things they're thinking about or questions they have of, like, maybe would this be a good topic? Anybody have anything they want to share or questions? I was that good. Okay, let's see. We have a question in the chat and I gotta look down here. Let's see, it says, speaking as a former MHD judge, the more you can think outside the box, the more you'll impress the judges and the more you'll learn. And the so what is crucial. Students typically do a good job of telling what happened, but fall down on the explaining why it was important. The so what, why would we care today? Yep, and that's a really good point. Every source that you look and you find, you should be thinking, okay, does this help me with communication and history? Does it help me, explain how it's the understanding, like what people understood or misunderstood from the topic? Does it help explain why it's important and why it matters? And another area we didn't talk too much about is the historical context, what was happening leading up to it. So any source you find, you need to make sure that they connect somehow to one of those things, the theme, the significance, or the context. And that'll make your project stronger and will make your work a little bit easier. Another question is, how could women narrow women's, how could a student narrow women's suffrage, which I think will be a popular topic and a topic I love. But definitely, you can't just do women's suffrage. So you could do an individual from the suffrage movement. You could find, there are a couple women from Michigan that were very influential in the movement in Michigan, and also some that were more at a national level. You could look at those. Anna Howard Shaw comes to mind with that. You could also pick a specific event, whether it was a protest march or a certain group within women's suffrage, that were working. So that would be some ways that you could narrow the topic of women's suffrage. You could also look at, there's the idea of women's suffrage leading up to the passing of the 19th Amendment, and then the 19th Amendment itself. Because it didn't just start happening in, 1918. Women weren't like, hey, I know what we should do. Let's try and make this work. No, it started way, way earlier in like the 1840s and the 1850s. So looking at the roots of it and focusing maybe on an early movement, early people like Susan B. Anthony, or women in 1912 in Michigan, they tried to pass through some constitutional conventions in Michigan, the Constitution, that women would have suffrage, and looking at those. So yeah, and that's a great point. You can't just do women's suffrage, just like you can't just do Motown, or you can't do World War II. You have to do, you have to narrow it down to something. Let's see. Any other questions or any other topics people are thinking about doing?
I was thinking of Amy. This is Bob Myers chiming in here, putting my 2 cents worth in. But the women's suffrage topic, I love it too. One thing that I was thinking of was with that is, how do they communicate their demands? Because they had to, in some ways they had to, and there was a lot of argument within the movement. Do you, how strident do you get with your demands? Do you try to, how do you dress? How do you make your demands but not alienate people? Because you still need the votes. And so you have to be careful with how you communicate what you want. And did that change over time? And who was involved there? Yeah, there's some great stuff there.
Yeah, that's a great point. I haven't thought of it that way, but yeah, that would be a really interesting way to look at it. Whether, because there's some groups that want to be more militant, or, and wanted to be, more out there. And then there were some groups that were trying to be more cautious and careful. So looking at that would be a great way to delve into the theme and kind of narrow your topic. I'm thinking, thanks, Bob.
Yeah, and I was just thinking with the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and you have the peaceful resistance like Martin Luther King, and then you have the more militant aspect of it, proponents of it, and the similarities there with women's suffrage, and my goodness, we see it today. Should you kneel during the national anthem? There's all that different kinds of communication. And are you going to alienate people? Are you going to bring people in? How do you communicate?
Exactly. Okay, anything else? Any other questions or topics? Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to stop recording our session here, and maybe